Folks, just a bit of background about Chris. Chris is actually an ex-Eskom member. He's an electrical engineer, qualified installation electrician, and a CEM. Things about energy Chris knows. At one stage, in my student days, I went to a presentation and behold, there was Chris talking. So he's been in the business a long time. Chris has been involved in electricity distribution industry since he started working with Eskom in 1991. Then he moved to private sector, which is rural maintenance, and has focused on turnaround of utility operations. Chris has been involved in turnkey, community services, delivery projects, and information management projects related to that. And he has 30 years experience in his chosen career. One of the things that Chris has said is that when a quality utility service is being delivered and built correctly, people will pay, which is something that we all need to take note of. Other than that, the reason that Chris popped onto the radar was that he was involved with the Frankfort solar embedded generation facility and its interactions with Frankfort town. And there are a number of things which are of interest there to South Africa in general. And I approached Chris and asked him if he could present to us on the Frankfort project and the background to it. There's a lot that's said in the news currently, but very little of it deals with the background stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris. Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Yes, what I'm going to do, I'm going to cover a number of subjects this afternoon briefly, and I'm sure there's going to be there's a lot of questions in those that may be attending today. And it's perhaps best to answer and address those questions to the full. So I'm not going to spend too much time on sharing information to you that may not be relevant. I'm going to give you guys, if we go to the agenda there, you can see we're covering a number of topics that I'm going to give you a proper oversight or overview on. And then from there, please make your notes and I'll answer questions to the best of my ability thereafter. If we can go to the next slide, you're going to see that the South African environment is, before a serious amount of load shedding, is already a difficult environment. And you know, people think that in the Western Cape, everything is okay. And if we can simply immigrate to the Western Cape, we'll be without any troubles. And nothing can be further from the truth. Even the economic data that you're showing there, all that shows is that the Western Cape is 2 years behind the rest of South Africa. And ultimately, the challenges that we are faced with today, the financial challenges, we are all facing as South Africans. And I think this is important. So when we deal with engineering are there to provide solutions, and solutions is what South Africa is in need of. So we can't go blind and say it's an Eskom problem, because it isn't an Eskom problem. It is now an all problem. We all suffering under the same. Even the Eskom employees, I think, have got a difficult time today. So it's important to understand that there's an economy that we need to get out of the doldrums, and I think engineers are going to get the economy out of the doldrums. Nobody else is coming to us. And if we move to the next slide, you guys can see there as well all those community organizations which have been in the press, and like Cederberg have actually won the elections in the Cederberg municipality in the Western Cape. Now, all those institutions kind of were not there 2-3 years ago, which shows that at the end of the day, South Africans have actually reached the end of the line. Everybody's looking for solutions. and another 50 basis points hike in the repo rate, which we're all expecting, is not going to make matters any easier. So even if we're looking at engineering solutions, most of those are USD or euro-based denominations. Well, everything has just become a couple of percent more expensive also with the currency that's further deteriorating. So at the end of the day, these organizations have been created and have sprung up everywhere kind of very, very naturally, because that's the state we're in. If we can take to the next slide. This is perhaps where it becomes slightly more difficult, because in South Africa, electricity is very much a regulated marketplace. We have the constitution, which designates municipalities having executive authority. On that, we also have Eskom, as call it loosely the supplier of last resort, that also operate in the various municipalities across South Africa. We then have the Electricity Regulation Act, and we have NERSA. And NERSA clearly states that they won't consider issuing a license to anybody else unless the current licensee actually doesn't support the application. So it makes it very difficult if government is losing, and if a quality institution like Eskom, which has been there for many years, the challenges that they are now facing and not being able to supply South Africa with electricity, together with the failings of government, is really a concern. Because how can we put solutions on the table that's workable as communities, as the private sector, because we have to adhere, all the solutions have to still fit into this regulated framework, which makes it very, very difficult. And I think that's where the challenge is going to be. There's going to be an enormous amount of pressure coming through from civil society. And I think as engineers in South Africa, we need to be ready to actually come to the party and have solutions handy, where solutions can be implemented and they can be beneficial and actually help those communities which are delivering those solutions. So if we take the next step, now you've got the background there. Let's have a look at the relevance of Frankfort. What has happened in Frankfort over the last 11, 12 years that we've been operating in Frankfort? First of all, excuse me, the municipality was failing. Long outages, they didn't have spare parts, they didn't have the expertise, there were major infrastructure failings and shortcomings. So the first thing we actually did wasn't collect revenue and put in meters or smart meters. What we actually did was we upgraded and strengthened the distribution infrastructure. We made sure that can we deliver services to the community as the community expects us to do. So the first step, and this for me is always interesting when people talk about, oh dear, we need to bring in engineering solutions, but the first thing we do is we go to smart meters. No, let's fix the infrastructure. With infrastructure, we actually build that customer loyalty, and that's why all the customers in our municipality, except obviously the municipality itself, but everybody pays. We've written off 62. And yes, the answer is 62, or shall I say it may be 65, but in any event, it's in the 60s that we wrote off electricity debts on customers that didn't pay. And that is servicing in the region of about 15,000 electricity users on a monthly basis. And that's the 62 to 65 odd customers that we disconnected and wrote the debts off. That was done over a period of 12 years that we've been operating the project now. So it very much is, without going legal, without fighting with people and suing them for money. All we did was we created brand loyalty, customer loyalty in the towns, and South Africans are really dinkum people. If you deliver the service, they actually pay for it. And that is something that in a meeting I was called to ABSA where I discussed as part of a panel of 4, there were about 2,000 of their credit managers. And that's one of the things that we discussed on Friday, is where we can say over the last 30 years that we've been in business, a bulk of that time has been delivering services to communities. And when you do deliver the service to community, they actually pay. So I think it was the banks definitely on Friday. They're going to look at it, the community structures with different eyes, because that is our reality, and we are very glad to take risk on our communities. But that brings us to that point number 3. We are in load shedding now. We have difficulty. Eskom can't supply the demand. And remember, our demand in all our towns, Frankfort and Villiers and Cornelia and Tweeling, our demand is actually happens from about 5:30 in the evenings to 8. That is where we are using the bulk of our demand, and the bulk of our electricity is being used in the evening peak. And remember, at that period of time, we don't have access to any generation capacity. So how do we, and NRS 048-9 actually makes provision, and it says the licensee should minimize the negative effects of load shedding. So what can we, as a service entity for a community, how can we actually minimize that? And firstly, as you can see there, 3A, is we implemented, we first of all communicated with the community. We got all their do's and don'ts. What would they want to see? What can we provide technically? How can things work? And ultimately, it culminated in us being able to deploy customized weekly load shedding schedules. And that was a tremendous hit, because the people actually can now plan. They know on what schedules they are on. And the small users have many more outages during the daytime. If it's stage 6, they still have their 6 outages during the day, but they are shorter outages. The big consumers, like the industrial conglomerates that produce our food, they don't want to be off for many periods during the day. They would rather, in a cyclical, as part of a cyclical cycle, they would want to be off for the full 9 hours if it's stage 6. And as the weekly cycles move, they cycle through their periods in the daytime. So everybody gets treated equitably on all fronts with what we've done as far as the customized weekly load shedding schedules are concerned. But the fact that we were able to split, and we were able to accommodate the large power users on their own medium voltage infrastructure, obviously helped the cause. And over the years that we've actually spent a lot of money on upgrading the infrastructure, we are now very flexible to provide the large power users with their own supply points. That's the one. The second thing, and I hear that, and I've seen also and firsthand spoken to municipal managers which are paying 300 and 350,000 rand a day on diesel to keep the pumps and the sanitation works operational. Yet they don't sit back and actually say, what can we do? Because remember, that amount of money for diesel over a short-term period could be workable, but over a long time, and we know that load shedding is here for a while to stay. You cannot run and saddle a community with a diesel bill, because then all the other service delivery mechanisms are going to start dropping. And we actually made use of the critical infrastructure. We made sure that only the critical infrastructure is operational 24/7 as allowed. And all the other customers that were on those feeds have either been removed, or we've placed the substations on remote switching, which means in a responsible manner, we can keep the critical infrastructure alive. Thirdly, also, the fact that we are doing the load shedding in the town of Frankfort, and it started off as a sandbox environment so that we can test things and actually see what works, what doesn't work, what is Eskom happy with, what are we happy with, so that we can come up with solutions. And ultimately, the backbone remains largely energized now, which meant the daily incidents of cable theft has also stopped. From the 1st of February, we've had two instances of low voltage cables that's been stolen, because the thieves don't know now which of the MV cables are alive. They're all in the same trenches. And the fact that we're doing rotational load shedding as per the Eskom approved schedule means that it's not as easy now to pull for infrastructure. And then a big one for us engineers, and if you can remember perhaps, Marcus, years back, you would have a look at low voltage and say, gee whiz, if it's a few seconds, then it's already unacceptable. We're sitting with low voltage instances of in minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half's duration, where we have huge low voltages. As Eskom switches and they switch back on, we have that network instability, which is only kind of reasonable to expect. If you switch those loads back on, there is going to be voltage volatility. And the fact that we are now switching the town in 5 stages, in 5 zones, that we rotate the load shedding cycles through, that means that when we switch back on, we're not switching those massive loads. We're actually coming in with a scalpel, and it's much easier, and I think much better for the network and the equipment to switch smaller loads more often than to actually just have the big hammer approach and nail it and have the consequences thereof. So low voltage events, those in the minutes, we've reduced from 30 over the same monthly period to 1, which is really a huge benefit. And then we came up with a new, after we actually metered and measured all the loads, although we're not doing it anymore, and guys, I'm still going to just touch on it so that you can see what the rationale was. The rationale at the end of the day is, if communities come together and they actually say that they're happy to invest in solutions, then there must be some form of a benefit for them to actually invest in a solution. And currently we don't have electricity. So anybody that would want to invest in electricity or generation or storage infrastructure does so with the expectation that they're going to have a little bit more electricity. And that's what, after on the voiding, and we'll get to that. I have a few graphs for you there so that we can go into more in depth on that. Then we go to our deployment of large solar generation. For the town, it's large for the town. And we've got 1 megawatt hour of storage that we have operational in Frankfort, and that has been operational for a year. We've had numerous issues with the batteries, and especially during transportation, that we nearly had to rebuild that battery container because of all the connectors and the shaking, even though the battery came on a air suspension. There are major issues. So that's perhaps something that you could flag for yourself. If you buy a battery, it's not to say that it's going to be operational from day one. And I think that's something that you guys need to allow for sufficient time to do recommission the unit when it gets delivered to site. And then the last step that we're going to embark on in Frankfort is to actually increase the generation and storage to such an extent that we actually can operate off the grid. And it's not to say that that's going to be our first choice, but we need to end up in that space, because on that basis, I'm sure if everybody takes their steps, we're going to give Eskom the breather that it needs. Now, if we can move to the next slide. The results that were achieved over the last 10 years that we've actually contributed there in Mafube, our calculations, we've paid Eskom, that's up to January, about 837 million now. No doubt if we weren't there, I wonder, it's debatable whether Eskom would have seen 50 million of the 837. With interest charges, that would be a significant amount that would be outstanding and due to Eskom. We've invested about 120 million, of which the last 20 million was done to actually strengthen the infrastructure from the other side of town, because the bulk intake is on the one side. Our renewable intake is on the other side of town, and you guys know that it's not as simple when you have to feed from the other side of town. Your cables are small and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, this has been our involvement there has made it possible for the big consumers to actually continue their operations and the community members to live. Although water and sanitation is still very problematic, at least the bulk of the electricity supply is working and their service delivery, and the people can still actually sell their house for quite a considerable bit more in a place like Frankfort than anybody else in the Free State can sell their houses. So we've made friends in Frankfort for good reason. Now let's go to the talk turkey. And I'm going to show you, there's the Frankfort's normal load, there's the date, those are the actual kilowatt hours, and you can see over the 5-year period there, our normal load deviates. If we can just go to the next slide, please, Francois, there we go. So there's Frankfort's normal load, you can see there's a 5-year period, and our deviation to the average varies from +2% to -2%. And there's the average kilowatt hours a day. So from 113 to 109, and the average over the last 5 years, as per the metered bulk intake meter, which mimics the Eskom bulk account, that gives you kind of the area that we play in. Now, let's go to the next slide. And if we go to the next slide, there you can see as we stopped voiding, we gathered information while we were voiding, and as we stopped voiding, we then brought that information. So you can see the first little block there is only for, and the second block is for 5 days, then it is for 10 days. The first one, the first block is not starting on the same Friday. The voiding stats is for a Friday to a Tuesday, while the not voiding stats are for a Saturday and a Wednesday, which is not ideal, but that's what we had directly thereafter. Then we brought it the next 5 days, and then we got to the third block where we were sitting now a Friday to a Sunday for 10 days and a Friday to a Sunday for 10 days, but there were public holidays in there, which perhaps then also skews. Then we got for the next 4 days, Monday to Thursday, and then there's the long period of 28 days, the last block in there from a Friday to a Thursday and from a Friday to a Thursday for the 28 days. Now, what these metering profiles actually tell us is that when we were generating more electricity for the load shed period, that we had to load shed. So let's say we had to load shed zone 2, and zone 2 is 2 megawatts. When zone 2 for 2 megawatts had to be load shed, and we were obtaining 3 or 3.5 megawatts from the PV plant, then our rationale was we've put new electricity onto the grid. We don't need to load shed that 2 megawatts because what we're generating is more than if we had to switch off. Now, one would then, a knee-jerk reaction would then be to say that, okay, if we don't switch off, it means we're going to use more electricity from Eskom. And this is what these figures actually show, that our normal load kilowatt hours, if we take the average of the 5 years, we get to 111,000 kilowatt hours per day. And there you can see that our kilowatt hours that we're using now from Eskom ranges from 59,000 kilowatt hours to 79,000 kilowatt hours for the day. If we take it over a 28-day period, then we can see when we were voiding, we used 72,000 kilowatt hours. Remember, this is when we didn't switch off. But when we switched off, as per Eskom's instruction, we then didn't use 72,000 kilowatt hours, we used 75,000 kilowatt hours. And every scenario that we've been working out and taking the actual tangible metering data, we've seen that when we don't switch off, we actually use less electricity. And we were at first dumbfounded about this and said, but one would expect if we're not switching off, we're going to use more electricity from Eskom. Until you remember that perhaps the battery statistics in South Africa is not as up to date. And we actually called one of the battery suppliers that we know quite well. And just in the last 10 months, they've supplied a gigawatt hour of battery into the South African market. Which means the moment we switch the electricity off, the guys use their batteries. The solar panels, the people that do have solar panels, they also are no longer in use. And then when the power comes back on, everybody then does what they wanted to do when the electricity goes off. So the stats actually showed to us that when we voided, we were actually using less electricity from Eskom than when we switched off. That's something that we presented to the Eskom guys. I don't know whether, because there weren't many technical guys in the meeting, but this is something that we would seriously want to actually investigate, regardless of whether voiding happens or not. But this shows that the moment the electricity goes off and things go cold, we actually use more electricity to get everything back to normal. And with more batteries that's being deployed out there, if you're a person in a townhouse complex or you in a flat, in a block of flats, how are you going to get over load shedding? You don't have any space for PV panels. You're going to just buy a battery tower, and actually that's how you're going to drive yourself, which means those without batteries are actually getting a raw deal, because it's as if this load shedding cycle is just going to, the more batteries, the higher level of load shedding is going to happen, which means at the end of the day, we need to get new capacity onto the grid like yesterday. Now, if we go to the next slide, just so that you guys can see there. Now, that dotted line, the graph that you see, is the orange is our actual load. But Francois, just go one slide back. I just want to bring to the attention something that's quite interesting. Is you guys can see there on the far right hand column, the deviation from normal is actually what Frankfort has reduced its ongoing consumption by. So you can see over the 28-day period, we've reduced consumption off normal by 35% during voiding and 32% during normal load shedding when we're not applying voiding, which is a huge amount of reduced usage from the Eskom grid compared to what we normally do. Okay, now if we go to the next slide, there you can see the orange line is what we are now using as load. That's the load curve, and the blue line is what we're actually using from Eskom. So you can see we're using a lot less from Eskom, and if we actually place this graph on any other town's graph, it would be interesting to actually see how that would pan out. But because we're also not allowed to export any of our electricity that we can access, that the solar energy that we can access, because we can't export anything, do you guys see the gray lines? Now, those are the gray lines where, because we're experiencing load shedding, there's reduced demand. That means that we actually switching off and throttling our inverters, because otherwise we would export a megawatt hour back onto the Eskom system. And that's what we mean is the actual metering profiles. And if you go and see how we throttle back our inverters when load shedding actually occurs, it's the plant is there, but because of load shedding, we actually, and the fact that we can go nowhere with that electricity, that means that we actually dumping those electricity during those stages of load shedding for that particular zone that was needed to be switched off. Now, the gray line that you can see there is had we not voided. The blue line is because we've at that stage still voided. we were just above the zero line, which meant we didn't dump in any electricity. But if we actually then switched off those customers, that would mean we would go about a megawatt into the negative. So it's not much, but for a small town and for an investment that the community has actually made, that is something that is significant, where if the sun shines and we are generating more electricity, then we could consider voiding, and that's actually what we did. So when there's rain or it's cloudy weather or it's evenings, we religiously follow the regime, the load shedding regime, because remember, Eskom is fragile. We cannot in any manner risk to actually damage that national asset, because that national asset, although we may not like it, it's the only asset that we have that's currently supplying us with electricity. Now, if we go to the next slide, there's the long and the short of it, and that what actually over 7 days there has happened. Eskom required us over that specific 7-day period to shed 22% of the load. We actually reduced that 22%, we actually reduced by 33.6%, which meant it's not double, but it's nearly double that we actually reduced our consumption by. And the fact now that we have done voiding or stopped voiding, that 33.6% went to 36.52%, because when we stop voiding, we have to actually throttle back our inverters, and that's why in this instance we actually reducing even further, which means that, and that's our entire problem statement, that we say, if we get a community to give 100 million rand to build new generation capacity. Remember, we're not talking batteries here that's just recycling Eskom's old electricity. When we're putting new generation capacity on the grid, not only should the guys just have suffered 21.96% load shedding, but they're actually suffering 36% load shedding, and they actually paid for the asset, which means that which other community is going to organize themselves, build new capacity that actually can alleviate the strain on Eskom, because it's reducing the loading. Now, just in that 7 days, there's 1.73 million rand, and it's probably closer to 2 million rand a week, that has gone into fuel like petrol and diesel generation, if that shortfall were to have been made up, which no community actually can afford. So the fact that we are in need of a solution is definitely important. Now, if we go to the next slide, and we say surplus energy. Now, on that, there's the common bus, Eskom transmission, 88 kV coming into the Frankfort substation, goes on to a 6.6 kV bus. That 6.6 kV bus feeds Eskom's own load. For this purposes, we've just put 3 megawatt on there. It may be 2.5 or it may be 3.5 megawatts, but it's round about there. And then the town's consumption is there off of its feeders. So when we generate more electricity with load shedding than what we can use, that electricity can actually be exported onto the common grid, and that could go to Eskom locally at the off the common bus. So that electricity that if we were able to actually export that to Eskom, wouldn't even go onto the transmission grid. It would just be used locally at source. And that's the beauty of our solution that we hope could actually help South Africa, is the fact that we are not placing huge power plants in the middle of nowhere, which means that has to go via a transmission grid to a load center. No, what we are doing is we're placing small generation plants into the load center, which means we actually freeing up the Eskom transmission system. So our view that we have is it's quite possible that 1,000 towns add 4 megawatts each to their local grid, where the load center is, which means we can provide Eskom relief, at least during the sunlight hours, with anything from 0 to 4,000 megawatts during the daytime, which must help Eskom in a manner, because if that electricity is generated and consumed at the same place, we don't involve the transmission infrastructure, and we actually free up so that those plants that's built in the middle of nowhere perhaps now has a chance of actually making use of the current Eskom transmission infrastructure, because the loading on that current transmission infrastructure is being reduced. So this is definitely in our consideration, is something that Eskom's senior Eskom technical guys and ladies should actually consider, because this is something that can happen anywhere and everywhere, and there are skills and expertise across South Africa. Each community can kind of, if there's a controlled environment that's made available for this type of solutions, then definitely a government can continue with its generation initiatives. But if the communities can actually do their bit, we can be out of our Eskom and out of our supply woes in just over a year or a year to 2 years. We can put thousands of megawatts onto the grid. Then just to round off on the next slide, that's how we our zones, our load shedding zones, there's 5 load shedding zones, and they all range between 1.5 to 2 megawatt apiece that we do our rotational load shedding. There you can see Namahadi, Eskom has that major portion within our network. So any excess electricity could actually easily have just gone into Namahadi without going into the grid. And then the next slide that we have, those are our customized load shedding schedules that I talked about earlier. And the customers that kind of were nearly crying, guys that work in big corporates. I've never experienced something like that in my life, where somebody takes his job so seriously. The next slide, if we can go to that, there's our quality of supply. Now, those downward lines, there's the 30 downward lines versus the one here on kind of the 24th of April on the right-hand side. And those are vary anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour and a half of low voltage, which is significant. And there where we took over the load shedding from the 1st of February to do the load shedding internally, we can see a much better profile that you can actually see. Now, the next slide, if we go, there's load curtailment. So we're making use of the whole toolbox that is made available so that we can provide this to the VKBs of this world. They're starting their big gens to keep some of their lines powered while now following the load curtailment process. And this started on last week, Wednesday. As I said, we're very thankful. Eskom is now starting to engage with us, and we coming up with solutions and getting them approved so that they can be implemented, and that we can look after our communities and the food producers in our communities. And there you can see as far as curtailment is concerned. And then if we go to the next slide, and that's basically what we say. Is we say, guys, we need, and if we're talking about municipalities, remember Eskom has their own woes, they will look after their own infrastructure, but where we can play a role, fix the distribution infrastructure, get it to a good quality standard, because then it gives you the alternatives and it gives you options to actually help your customers with load shedding. And I think the thing that we forget is, our customers are not there to fund our municipal budgets. Our customers are there to actually employ people, make a bit of money, contribute to the economy. That's what our customers are there for. The moment they can't make a bit of money and contribute to the community and to South African economy, it means they're going to stop doing that. And if they stop doing that, where's our income as electricity distributors? Our income is gone. And that is going to be that final death spiral. So we need to look after our customers and our electricity users so that we can give them a fair deal and keep them alive. Secondly, that infrastructure strengthening has to be able to cater for new embedded generation sources so that we can free up space on the transmission grid. If we can generate more electricity locally at the load centers, it means we're going to actually reduce the loading on the Eskom transmission infrastructure. And then thirdly, there is exactly basically what I've said is we need to negate the need for wheeling and giving the grid an opportunity. So what we are saying is we're saying somewhere in there is going to be an answer, because neighbors and communities should be able to look after themselves in this crisis. If government can't supply, we cannot expect somebody to go hungry if he doesn't have food and is not allowed to plant his own mealies or tomatoes or potatoes or whatever he needs to actually sustain himself. And this is the same thing we're going to see. If we can't supply electricity to our communities, we don't give them a structured way of contributing to the solution, then we're going to find guys doing their own thing, and that could be a problem definitely for the national grid. So we hope that somewhere in the near future, all the powers to be is going to sit together and say, how can we make sure that neighbors can club together to help themselves, which will give government a breathing space to execute their generation plan, and it will give Eskom a breather to actually generate its plans on how to deal with load shedding. And that really is the overview from my side. I hope I haven't been too long. I hope I've been able to share a little bit of light. And I don't know, Marcus, I'm happy to answer questions if your time allows.
Chris, thanks very much for the presentation. That's much appreciated. I would like to just kick off, and I'm sure that the other folks in the audience will come in. The first question I have is, you reported that the cost once you had this system in place, the cost to your customers was reduced by roughly 15%. Can you perhaps comment on what kind of behavior change you saw with those customers seeing a price reduction like that? Thanks.
Okay, now you're talking about what we pay for electricity. So the deal we've done with the community sun farm is that we pay megaflex energy rates less 15%. So remember, we don't pay demand charges, we don't, and then whatever on the energy rates, we only pay the energy rate, so we get it at megaflex less 15%. That megaflex less 15% obviously flows into our financials, which financials are presented to NERSA via the D forms and our actual audited financials that's being provided. But what I must say to you is, the answer, we haven't started looking at reducing costs to our customers now. We have started in 2013 by reducing so we got a approval from NERSA to say, okay, guys, I don't know, I can't remember now what it was in 2013. I'm just going to take a number. Let's say it's 10%. We then wrote to NERSA and said, NERSA, we're actually not comfortable with your 10% increase. We had a meeting. They arranged a meeting in Pretoria. Everybody was in that boardroom. And they said, okay, so what do you want if you don't want 10%? How much more do you want? And we said, sorry, there's been a misunderstanding. Although you've awarded us the 10% already, we want less. And we have, over the last 12 years, we have 10 years of the 12 years. We have reduced the tariff that NERSA has already approved for us, because we reduced the losses on the network. We're sitting at about anywhere between 5 and 6% of the kilowatt hours that we lose, and that is due to non-payment and due to technical and non-technical losses. So our losses are very low, which means we can actually now afford, if we manage our network very stringently, we can actually reduce the cost to our customers. And that's why we have a loyal customer following. I think in last year's tariff increase has been the first time that The Mafube tariff is actually for prepaid residential customers is actually now lower than what the Eskom prepaid tariff is, and that's how we've tried to, by optimizing, by keeping the community close, by understanding that we are actually there to serve the community. How do we improve their lot? Because their lot, if they are positive and economically well off, we're going to be economically well off. And I think that message has gone through, and that's perhaps something that those of us that's on this call today can actually take out and say, but if you trust your communities, I don't think they, and we haven't in 30 years, they haven't let us down. Deliver the service, try and reduce the costs for them, operate in an efficient manner. So we're doing everything from our part to actually try and reduce tariffs. And this sun farm that was provided by the community is just another case that we get electricity at Megaflex less 15%. I hope that answers your question, Marcus.
Yeah, yes and no. I think in the time that we have, it's good. Thank you. Just one last question. When you talk about the sun farm, can you clarify what the capacity is? Roughly how much it cost how long it took to connect, and what ROI you're expecting from it?
Okay, now we have currently operational about 3780 kilowatts. That's 4 small farms, and the largest one is 1020 kilowatts, and the smallest one is 700 kilowatts out of the 4, and the 4 together make up 3780 kilowatts that we have operational there in Frankfort. The last phase was commissioned in December of 2022, which is at the end of last year. And sorry, you had one other question in there, Marcus. What was that?
Actually, 2 questions. How much did it cost in total? How long did it take to connect, and what was your ROI on that?
Okay, now everything is in place for farm number 5, which is a small one. It's about 500 kilowatts. The entire thing, from buying the land, because the local agri guys made the land available, but we still paid commercial prices for it. The land, the security, the strengthening of the actual networks, in the town networks that had to be strengthened. So it's not just actually packing a few panels with the inverters that's installed in a building. All the substations, it was a greenfield project. The works was about 100 million rand for the 4.26 megawatts that it's going to be ultimately once we commission the last 500 kilowatts. So it was about 100 million rand for that process. There's 21 shareholders. I know you didn't ask. There's 21 shareholders, of which we represent 2 of those shareholders, and there's 19 farmers and local businessmen make up the rest. And we have a small 480 kilowatt plant operational in Tweeling also, and we have this 3.78 megawatt farm in Frankfort. And we're planning now, we're going to approach NERSA and Eskom in the near future to find out if we can do the same thing in Villiers. But before we do it, guys, how are we going to push benefits through to the community?
Thanks. So just the 2 more questions. How long did it take to connect? And what sort of ROI are you expecting on these business cases? Thanks.
We started, I think, in the beginning of 2021, call it the first quarter of 2021. So it was about 2 years for us. The first couple of months we lost to actually get everything together. And the ROI that we actually worked on is we worked on an ROI saying to the community guys, listen here, you won't make a loss. You'll get your money back, because that's all that we are. We don't want these type of community projects to be funded with a profit mentality, because then we're losing. What are we doing it for? We're doing it actually to actually get the communities going. So at the end of the day, I think the figure that we then showed was about 8%. And I can tell you on Megaflex, less 15%, it's going to be a material ROI is going to be materially higher than 8%. We're probably going to run into the 20s, which means there's a lot of margin in what we're doing to actually look at reducing tariffs. And our next step is to see how can we increase the generation capacity without actually increasing the tariffs. That's going to be our next challenge, because we think that's possible.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Much appreciated. I see Tsolani's made a comment here. Tsolani, would you like to come in with your comment? Okay, I've got nothing from Tsolani. Wayne Kitching has said Eskom expected the demand KVA to be reduced during load shedding, not the energy. Do you have plans to align better with the times that Eskom actually needs the capacity the most? DSM and demand response, or maybe options you can consider. Tsolani is struggling with his mic. I'll repeat for you. Eskom expected demand KVA to be reduced during load shedding, not the energy. Do you have plans to align better with the times that Eskom actually needs the capacity the most? DSM and demand response, or maybe options you can consider. Thanks.
Yes, that's obviously the holy grail, but the way we see it and what we've experienced, and I think what South Africa has experienced over the last couple of months, is a Sunday or a public holiday, there is no holy grail anymore. Eskom needs it all the time. And if Eskom was only off and they were constrained during the early evenings, it would have been easy to align with that. If Eskom is only off early mornings, it would have been much easier to align with that. The fact is, and that makes it very difficult, in this week, we've gone from where Eskom notified us there's no load shedding to stage 1, to stage 3, to stage 5. There were 4 or 5 changes in the space of one day. That makes it very difficult to actually go and have a look and say, okay, how can we mitigate that? The only way we can mitigate, and that's the way we're going now, is to actually add batteries to our PV plant so that we can actually use it when we want to use it. So chances are that we will, in the very near future, be able to say to Eskom, okay, you guys can flick the switch again, we go off, and we have our PV and our batteries to drive the entire town through a 2-hour load shedding period. And that is our next step that we're busy working on that. And I can't see any other solution in the status that Eskom is in than to actually have a huge capacity, stored energy capacity available so that you can see the town through. Now, you rightly say the Eskom needs a demand reduction when they need the demand reduction. The challenge now is that at the end of the day, we're hearing on radio and on television and in chat rooms and on podcasts that this is a South African problem and South Africans need to actually come to the party. So, okay, I now come to the party and I say, here's 100 million rand that I can invest. What do I get out of it? And I think that's the challenge that we need to get to, is because as it stands now, anything that is embedded, Eskom is going to say is now part of the normal load, which is something that we obviously disagree with. But the Eskom says that's part of the normal load. So you've made the investment. That's it. We can't. You're not going to get any uptime as far as energy uptime is concerned, because I need the electricity to be off now. But ultimately, Eskom sits with all the switches in Samapan. So they can the more communities that actually put new generation capacity on the grid, it is going to alleviate that constraint that Eskom is feeling now. So there's a rational approach to all of this, and if you apply a little bit of common sense, it's not just, guys, we need the reduction now. Yes, we need the reduction now, but we basically under constant load shedding. We're under constant, if we're not in load shedding, it's just a mere hours away or perhaps a day or two away, and we will be back in load shedding. So we need to change that approach to come up with solutions that actually will address the actual need, and the actual need is we need more new electricity onto the grid.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's interesting to me that your conversation has sort of gone with the interplay between the electricity and the almost the macroeconomics of South Africa. Obviously, one of the questions that is sitting in the background all the time is how many communities are doing a similar thing to this around South Africa, and what is preventing them from scaling these kind of interventions. Do you have any comment there? You obviously have run into other organizations which are doing similar interventions. Do you have any comment there?
Yes, we don't know of any other community organization that's sitting in the position that we are in. And remember, if two farmers or two businesses want to cooperate across their border of their property, their title deed, that is actually illegal. And that's what we're saying is, for the real problem to be addressed in South Africa, we need to make it possible for community members and communities to actually cooperate with one another to come up with their solutions. But the way that the acts are written at this stage and the way NERSA sees it, and that makes it very, very difficult to actually why there aren't more, because there should be a lot of these initiatives when new electricity is being put on the grid. Alternatively, we do know of a few where guys have simply clubbed together and they're doing their own thing there in the sticks, and it's working for them. But that's not ideally the way that one should go about it. One should actually set up a framework for that so that can be done in an organized and orderly fashion. But in failing that, with all the community upheaval that's being faced, I can see we're going to run into trouble if government doesn't bring some sort of normality to get in place that communities and neighbors can actually help themselves.
Okay, thank you. Mondi, I see your hand is up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, no, I think just a good presentation. So I just wanted to know, most of these networks, especially in remote areas, you find that they are quite weak. So what I wanted to check with Chris is, were there any studies that were done to check whether the network in that local area is able to take that much generation capacity from renewables? Thanks.
You spot on.
So this is aligned to now your NRS 097 studies that are required. Thanks.
You're 100% right, Mondi. Those networks were definitely not able to cater for the various injection points on the other side of town. They were actually barely strong enough to just carry the load to the actual load points scattered in the municipal supply area. What we have done is the University of Stellenbosch, with a few of their guys on our busy modeling, because we have so many injection points, and what we want to know is, with all the PV and batteries that's located within the network, which is not being registered by those customers that simply put them up. People are very skittish to actually come and say what they do, regardless of the fact that there's a SACG tariff and we can actually provide them with money if they do export. People don't want to register. So we want to actually see what is the effect of the network if we model not just the community sun farms that's being used now, but if we actually add a number of PV and battery sources within to see how the flows reverse, because we definitely know that there's a reverse of flow that's happening at various times in the day. And we hope we can have the answer for you on that one in probably the next couple of weeks. That we're waiting for that to make sure that our protection and everything else is aligned to what is actually happening on that network. So the network has been strengthened. It's coping with what we've been asking the network to actually cope with. Things are operating very stably and nicely and solidly. But at the end of the day, we're busy now to actually see what exactly those power flows are doing at the various times in the day.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question. Lungile Mashele's put up a hand. Lungile, do you want to go with the question?
Thank you. A quick one. Just wanted to find out who funded you. I'm aware that for future projects, you are speaking to commercial lenders, but for the initial projects, who was the funder?
Just the community. There's no debt. It was all funded by equity.
Lungile, you happy with that?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a hand up from JB.
That's me, I think.
Oh, Jana, thank you so much.
Sorry, I needed to realize what my own initial is. Luckily, I'm awake. First, I want to apologize that I had to take a call just as you started with the question, so I might repeat some of the areas, but I just wanted to give a few comments and here and there a question. So first of all, I think it was great work and great presentation. Thank you very much. And I think there's lots of insight to learn from this as well. And I think definitely there's value in everyone standing together. And I think we must make sure that we don't, but maybe that's my we speaking from Eskom side, there is the government against all of us as well. Remember, there's a lot of good engineers in Eskom as well. And if everyone takes hands and do this together, then there will definitely be some good things coming from that. I just wanted to highlight that you mentioned blackout versus load shedding. Load shedding is not blackouts. Load shedding is exactly a tool to hinder us from getting to a stage where we get on full-on blackouts. So load shedding is a tool, and I think you guys demonstrated how we can optimize load shedding, and I think that is a learning from for Eskom side as well. So there's a certain amount that needs to be load shed due to the supply gap. However, the way that it's being done should be closely monitored and optimized, and I think you guys have managed to do that and show how you can consistently load shed, and I think a lot of municipalities and metros can learn from that in how you actually load shed and optimize that load shedding to alleviate the symptoms of load shedding as much as possible. Then I just wanted to mention, you mentioned that you would like to go off grid at some time. Is that off grid or is it still grid tied? Because even on your slide 10, you can surely see what the offset of the difference of being off grid and grid tied is. There's a certain point in time when you do come back to the network. And that is, unfortunately, from Eskom side, that is part of the major problem that we have. Is currently the usage is being offset, but the capacity that Eskom still has to cater for is still being reached. So as soon as you mention somewhere that while the sun is shining, you can offset your usage. But the problem probably gets to the fact that when we get to 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night in winter, then there's very little offset unless your batteries is allowing you to shift your load patterns. Then I think it would be a different sense of optimizing. When we get to a point where we not necessarily use less, but we just shifting our loads. Because I also wanted to know if you are using your batteries only from, is your batteries charging only from the solar, or is it also charging from Eskom? Because if it's also charging from Eskom, you're basically just shifting your load pattern, because then you are charging it and you would use that charged power just in a different time set where you couldn't use it because it's not available from Eskom's side. So maybe I should pause there for a small question.
Okay, so basically, just to come back to your lot of good engineers in Eskom, and I don't know whether you were on the call then, and that's also why I said Eskom. I think the Eskom employees have got the short end of the stick also now where we sit, and there are good guys there. So you're 100% right, Jana. But we need to actually take hands and learn from these experiences, because
Yes.
that ultimately is what we may have 20% of the answer. But if we get the right Eskom team on the other side of the table, they could come up with the other 80%, and slap bang, we actually have something to go and fire in a very short period of time. So we on your page totally. As far as blackout and load shedding is concerned, I think that's kind of the blackout, which if we have half a technical qualification with some work experience, that is something that should never happen. That's just the simple answer, because at the end of the day, you can switch everything off except keeping something on, which we need to be on. So we should never ever run into a blackout situation. But then again, what we need to, if you plan typically from us in the private sector, we try and say, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? And if that worst thing actually happens, then what? And so from our side, we're just going totally over the top to say, okay, if such a thing were to happen, or not even a blackout, it just means that there's no electricity perhaps for 3 or 4 days because Eskom didn't allow a blackout to actually occur, but it's going to take time for them to fix or do whatever they need to do. What are we then doing in a town when we don't have access to electricity? So we are definitely planning to operate without being grid tied. So you also mentioned that the loading 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening, and in fact for us from about 4 in the afternoons we're generating nearly nothing. Not nearly nothing, but nearly nothing in the scheme of things. So we only see a productive period, if we're lucky, is between 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, which our maximum demand and all of that actually occurs from 5:30 to 8 p.m., which is when Eskom is strained. We do have that megawatt hour of battery that we charge during the daytime, and we use that. So in our little bit, we offset 300 kilowatts or so in the evening, which hopefully helps a teeny little bit for Eskom. And we actually trying the batteries, because we need to increase, if we're going to deploy 12 megawatt hours of battery storage is what we're planning to do now this year still. And if we deploy 12 megawatt hours of battery, we're going to actually increase our PV. And we have we've identified our site where we're going to increase the PV, so that we have with our battery storage, with our PV, we also have diesel generation in place, so that we can, through critical times, have a little bit of diesel, so that we also can, all of that is synchronized, not onto the sources of supply, and if Eskom goes completely dark, we can still power up most of the town for most of the day. That's the plan that we busy deploying. And then in a couple of years, because we're cooperating with agriculture, where we are going to manufacture and a lot of our shareholders are some of the mega farmers in that area, owning their own fertilizer plants. They want ammonia. And we are probably going to provide them with ammonia, green ammonia, and for that our storage will be heat storage with normal steam turbines. One steam turbine, 25 megawatt steam turbine, which will give us that inertia to actually then be able to say comfortably, guys, we can remain off the grid because we have our lithium ion, we have our heat storage, we have our steam turbine, and we're actually supplying the electricity in that area, all off the back of green ammonia that we're supplying to the very same shareholders that actually use it for their green crops, green irrigation, and that crop can then be exported to the EU, and the border adjustments which are coming into play this year won't actually harm their cause. So the bigger picture is to actually get a community to say, guys, it's stupid to go off the Eskom grid while there's electricity. So we will always take electricity from Eskom if we can. But hopefully shortly, if you do go off, we'll be able to actually run without being synchronized to yourself, Jana. I hope that answers those questions.
Yeah, that question is definitely answered, and I think yes, as long as you realize that. So yes, you're bringing alleviation in the middle of the day with regards to stabilizing the system, but that alleviation also has a certain impact on the tariff and the revenue collection from our side as well. So that has a spin over in the entire system and how we run it. So the better thing for us is, with all due respect said, is that if everyone can go off grid, it's not really off grid, it's creating sort of a microgrid, and then disconnect, then it would really alleviate the national project. But it's not really alleviate, it's just creating a different subset of how we then structure our entire country's electricity structure. On that point, just the last one, Marcus, sorry, is with regards to the tariff, it would be interesting for me to see a cost reflective comparison on what your customers would pay for the service that you are currently providing them. So your service being a combination of renewable sources, batteries, and a little bit of diesel, as you mentioned. So and maybe later on ammonia and gas and all sorts of things. So the combination of how you structure what you would be charging them or how you would recover your cost versus what the current Eskom tariff is. Because obviously you're offsetting what you're paying to Eskom, but you have to generate on your own, and that also has a price to it. So earlier on in the meeting, I don't know if it was you guys or someone mentioned that any customer is prepared to pay as long as they get a sufficient, sustainable product. And that is another point of discussion, maybe for a total another day, but it would be very interesting to see your cost comparison to see if that's really true, because I have got a hunch that what we are providing at currently at Eskom side and what you would be providing at the current cost of renewables and batteries might be higher, but with a more sustainable solution. So, and that would be an interesting comparison to make.
You're 100% right. Let's just address your comment on the revenue. What has happened with our small little distribution business out of those 4 towns is we've seen a revenue loss of about 35%, which is a massive reduction. Your OPEX, this is what, I don't have to tell you anything about that. I think Eskom is suffering the same fate, which means that we're not sustainable. We're not economically sustainable on the basis of not doing anything. We have to do something, because we can't accept a third revenue reduction and still think we're going to provide a service to the towns. Now,
well, that's kind of where Eskom sits as well, in a greater manner.
Correct. So what we are now saying is we're busy with our cost of supply study, a complete rework, because in the normal cost of supply study, our poor customers are actually being subsidized heavily by every other tariff component. And that's also difficult for government to actually sit and say, okay, well, these guys have to come up a little bit, which we're sitting with the same challenges as you are sitting in. But what we have done in these various supply alternatives is we found that the communities are actually happy to fund their capex. Now, remember, if we don't take loans like what Eskom has to do, go and take loans and build capex and fund it and then sell it and recover it via the electricity sales, if we get our capex from our community, then all of a sudden the fact that we can supply electricity at as close to the going rate as is currently battery, obviously be a little bit generous and allow 10% for round tripping and the like. But all of a sudden, when you do that, then it's simply a case of, and all your metering is in place that you know who uses what when. Somebody uses diesel power, they pay for the diesel rate. Somebody doesn't use diesel power, they don't pay for that. We are able to actually keep the tariffs very much similar. And if we add a lot more PV into our mix, we can get the PV power a lot cheaper than we can get anything else. The storage is then the expensive part, which you need to deal with, which is the after hours and the inclement weather portion, because you have to get through that. And but our preliminary figures actually surprised us. It's actually not as bad as what we thought it was going to be, and be glad to at some stage have a discussion with you, even if it's offline, so that we compare notes, because I think this is important for us. We need to come up together with solutions that can work.
Yes,
Thanks.
sure.
Thanks, Chris and Jana. The issue is clearly standardization of what you call a cost of supply when the structure is different in the comparisons being tabled. Chris, I need to close it off now, but thank you very much from our side as Load Research Chapter. You've given us a lot to think about and perhaps discuss in the background, and we need to make a decision about whether to take this presentation forward to the greater SAIEE. So really appreciate you sitting in, and to our colleagues that are in here today, thank you very much for your input. Any final words?
No, thank you, Marcus. I've been a member of SAIEE now for, I don't know, 28 or 29, perhaps a little bit longer years. And this is the first meeting I've been to. I shouldn't say that loud, but thank you for finally.
We're glad to have you back.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much.